You didn't lose control because she went too far. You lost it because you never had the control to begin with. It's not her gaze, nor the calculated silence, nor that disdainful whisper that ruins your day. It's your reaction to it all. A reaction that, biologically, shouldn't last more than 90 seconds, but which you insist on turning into hours, days, weeks of mental warfare. The exploding anger, the suffocating hurt, the festering resentment. All of this is artificially kept alive, like a fire that only continues because you refuse to let go of the gasoline can. Science has already proven it. When you are triggered by a provocation, your body releases a surge of stress hormones. This surge is real, physiological, intense, but it's also temporary, 90 seconds. That's the time your body needs to neutralize this internal storm, provided you don't fuel the flame with your thoughts, provided you don't activate revenge mode, provided you don't cling to the idea that you have something to prove. But you cling on because you think you're defending your honor, because you believe that showing coldness in the face of disrespect is a sign of weakness, because you want her to see the pain she caused. You delude yourself into thinking that by getting angry you're asserting yourself, when in reality you're just confessing, without realizing it, that you've handed over control of your peace to someone else. What drives you crazy isn't what she does, it's what it reveals about you. And here's the brutal contradiction. The more you react, the more power you give her. And the more power you give her, the more invisible you become to her. We live in a culture where men confuse intensity with emotional strength, where shouting is still confused with leadership and silence with submission. Nothing more archaic, nothing more vulnerable. Friedrich Nietzsche said that true strength is the ability to withstand internal tensions without succumbing to them. The weak need to unload, the strong overflow without dissolving. And as brutal as it may seem, a man who doesn't control his own anger is always manipulated by someone who knows how to trigger it. She may not know exactly what she's doing, but unconsciously she tests his stability. She observes his reactions. She identifies his triggers, not out of malice, but out of nature. Because emotional security is one of the most subconscious criteria of female attraction. And every man who reacts with fury at the slightest sign of frustration communicates a truth that no perfume, car, or catchphrase can hide. He is not in control of himself. But there is something even more dangerous than explosive anger, silent anger. The kind that festers, that accumulates behind polite smiles and swallowed silences. It is more insidious because it disguises itself as self-control, when in reality it is just self-deception. It transforms you into an emotional vessel, loaded, ready to explode at the next misinterpreted gesture. This type of accumulation destroys relationships, friendships, and, above all, your own sense of clarity. Because a man who doesn't understand his reactions begins to suspect everything and everyone, and becomes a prisoner of his own interpretations. A simple good morning becomes contempt. A pause on WhatsApp transforms into betrayal. A careless glance is already fatal disinterest. There is no lucidity when you live in a state of emotional alert. And the most uncomfortable truth is, nobody puts you in that state. You go there on your own. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote one of the most powerful phrases of the 20th century. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. Frankl lost everything. Family, friends, freedom. But he discovered that, even in the worst human conditions, there was still a point where the human being could be inviolable. Their choice. If he found freedom in an extermination camp, why do you keep saying you can't ignore an ironic comment from a woman on Instagram? This is the uncomfortable part. The part nobody likes to hear. But it's also the part that liberates you. When you understand that the woman who ignores you, who provokes you, who tests your limits is not your enemy, but your emotional coach, the game changes. You stop being the victim who asks, "Why does she treat me like this?" and become the operator who asks, "Why does this still affect me?" Every provocation hides an opportunity for emotional dominance. Every rejection reveals a blind spot. Every anger, when well interpreted, becomes a map of your own evolution. But it takes courage to look. Courage to admit that the problem was never her. It is precisely here that this video begins to become dangerous. Because it will take away all your excuses. It will remove the comfort of pointing the finger. It will deconstruct the fantasy that there is some woman with enough magical power to unbalance an emotionally mature man. And it will place in your hands a mirror that you might prefer not to look at. But if you have the audacity to face that reflection without looking away, you will access something that few men even know exists. A state of emotional sovereignty so strong that no test, rejection, or silence can break it. A state where you don't shield yourself. You simply aren't affected, and not because you're cold, but because you're in control. Have you ever said or thought something like, "She knows how to get under my skin"? Sound familiar? Well, know this. That phrase is a confession. A surrender. A password to access your emotional system. When you say that someone knows how to push your buttons, what you're saying, even without realizing it, is that you're not in control. It's her. And more than that, it's your past. Your unresolved pain. Your still fragmented identity. You describe yourself as a remote control with visible vulnerable keys, and worse, without a password, without encryption, ready to be used by anyone with a sharp finger and calculated timing. But here's the brutal truth. Nobody presses a button you haven't made available. They weren't put there by her. They were given to you by you. Installed by the repetition of poorly digested experiences, programmed by childhood memories, reinforced by values you yourself can't name, but which control you like invisible strings. And the worst part, you react with hatred to the person who revealed the button, not to the system that built it. You fight against the mirror, trying to break it, instead of facing the reflection. Imagine the following scene. You're in a recent relationship or flirtation, and everything is going well until the moment she compliments another man, maybe an ex, a coworker, an Instagram friend. In a matter of seconds, something ignites inside you, an inner heat, a lump in your throat, the urge to prove something. You try to hide it, try to rationalize it, but the damage is already done. And you tell yourself, she does this on purpose. She knows it irritates me. But is it about the compliment? Or did the compliment unintentionally trigger an old insecurity? Perhaps about not feeling good enough? Perhaps the memory of when your mother compared you to someone more educated, more intelligent, more successful? The compliment was the finger. But the button was already there, exposed, in need of protection. And the most dangerous part? You didn't even know it existed until she touched it. Carl Jung said that until you make conscious what is in the unconscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. In other words, until you identify your own emotional triggers, you will continue to think that others are destabilizing you. You will continue to live on autopilot, reacting to things. You will continue to blame women for what is, in fact, the emotional mirror of your childhood, your history, your still unfinished identity. This is not cheap self-help. This is strategic emotional engineering. What you need to understand and deeply internalize is that each emotional trigger is the visible tip of an unhealed wound. And every time you explode or shut down because of a woman, you are acting like a poorly programmed system, vulnerable to any external command. Your anger is not about what happened now. It's about what you never processed before. And every woman who makes you lose your head is in fact a messenger, an opportunity in disguise. A thermometer that reveals where there is still internal fever. And here's the irony that few realize. The angrier you are towards someone, the more power that person has over you. And the more you try to control their behavior to avoid being triggered, the weaker you become. Because whoever needs to control others to maintain inner peace has already confessed that they have no control at all. Let's illustrate this with a more practical example. Imagine you're at dinner with your partner. In the middle of the conversation, she makes a sarcastic joke about how you don't know how to manage your finances. The table laughs. You freeze. Your eyes harden. Your stomach clenches. Inside, a voice screams, "She disrespected me in public." But that voice isn't coming from the present. It comes from another time. From when you were a teenager and heard your mother say, in front of the neighbors, that you were irresponsible. Or from when your father lost his temper, seeing you make a simple math mistake and said that, with that reasoning, you'll never amount to anything. What she said was a phrase. What you felt was a history. If you had done serious emotional work, her statement would have been just that, a statement. But because your buttons are still exposed, it was a trigger. And you, a hostage. This is where the turning point comes in. From now on, you need to commit to the following internal code of conduct. Every time I react with anger, pain, or resentment, I will investigate the trigger, not the person. Because the trigger is yours. It's your history, your emotional biography, your poorly digested internal narrative. The power lies in who identifies it, not in who reacts. You can continue fighting against women, or you can start mapping your internal system. One is eternal war. The other is ultimate mastery. But be warned. This transition of control demands brutal honesty. Because you will realize that much of what you thought was disrespect was just your own lack of stability. That what you called provocation was just a mirror. That the woman you considered manipulative was, in fact, just a figure who made you realize how easily you are still shaken. It's hard, yes, but it's liberating. Because from here on out, you stop trying to fix women's behavior and start reprogramming your own internal structure. Imagine if, instead of getting irritated, you started observing yourself. Instead of judging, you investigated. Instead of exploding, you mapped things out. You would begin to realize that much of what drives you crazy has more to do with the stories you've told yourself throughout your life than with anything it has done. What it provokes in you is, at its core, an opportunity. An opportunity to deactivate, to integrate, to reprogram. That's the difference between the average person and the emotional strategist. The first lives reacting to everything and everyone. The second transforms every discomfort into a diagnosis. The first lives protecting himself, controlling, trying to avoid triggers. The second welcomes triggers as clues to where he still needs to mature. And that, my brother, is power. Because the man who no longer has exposed buttons, that man is untouchable. He doesn't shut down. He doesn't explode. He observes. He responds. He operates. And now comes the most practical part of this journey. You need to start naming your triggers. Grab a pen and paper, or your most recent memory, and bring to mind a woman who threw you off balance. What exactly did she do or say? What did it remind you of? When in your life have you felt like this before? What emotions were involved? If you do this exercise honestly, you'll realize that what hurt you wasn't her. It was the memory she triggered, the emotional scenario she recreated. And that changes everything. Because now, instead of running away from women who challenge you, you'll start using them as training grounds. Each provocative woman, each test, each unpredictable attitude becomes a chance to scan your own emotional structure, to look for where there are still cracks, to strengthen, to integrate, to cleanse. And over time, you begin to notice something curious. Those same attitudes that once unbalanced you now barely affect you. Because the button has been deactivated, because the wound has healed, because the narrative has been reframed. This, my friend, is the beginning of emotional freedom. And here is the final contradiction I want to leave you with in this chapter. The strongest men I know are not those who impose limits with shouts, threats, or frowns. They are the ones who smile, even when tested. They are the ones who listen, even when provoked. They are the ones who, faced with an emotional attack, maintain their composure. Not out of weakness, but because they know that only those who are still chained react. Only those who are still squeezed inside explode. Only those who still carry old offenses take offense. Most men believe that their anger is a legitimate way to express authority. They confuse aggression with presence, volume with leadership, and tension with power. But anger is rarely the original emotion. It's a disguise, an emotional bodyguard. Anger appears when more vulnerable feelings threaten to surface: hurt, fear, shame, rejection. It emerges as a defense mechanism, an emotional armor forged to hide what, deep down, we consider too weak to show. But here's the twist that few dare to face. The real weakness isn't in feeling these subtle emotions. It's in not recognizing them. It's in covering them up with shouts, irony, explosions, or poisonous silences. Let's be clear. When you get irritated because she didn't reply to your message in half an hour, it's not anger. It's insecurity disguised as indignation. It's the fear of being devalued, overlooked, forgotten. When you explode because she forgot what you said yesterday, it's not fury. It's the frustration of not feeling heard. When you become hostile because she complimented another man, you're not angry. You're afraid of not being enough. But because the male ego has been trained to despise any emotion that sounds like weakness, you resort to the only socially acceptable emotional mask for men: anger. This strategy seems to work for a while. You command respect, create distance, change her behavior. But there's a cost, an invisible yet profound cost. You become emotionally illiterate, unable to read your own pain, unable to access what's behind your reactivity, unable to evolve. Because you see, emotional evolution doesn't come from repression, it comes from translation. You only become mature when you learn to translate your reactions into original emotions. You only become an emotional operator when you learn to name what you're really feeling. Not what it seems, but what it is. Let's look at a practical example. You're in an argument with your partner. She interrupts you mid-sentence and utters a sarcastic phrase. Your face flushes, your body stiffens, and anger takes over. But if you stop, if you have the strategic composure to slow down your reaction, you'll realize that anger isn't the first feeling that arose. It's the second layer. The first was the feeling of disrespect. Right behind it, the feeling of not being heard. And deeper, perhaps, the old wound of not being considered important, a feeling you've known since childhood, when nobody paid attention to what you said. Anger, therefore, is the alarm. But vulnerability is the fire. This understanding is liberating, because from it, you no longer need to fight against anger. You only need to listen to what it's trying to hide. Anger is a code, a password, a defense system that reveals that something more sensitive is asking to be looked at. Ignoring this is living like an emotional soldier, always ready for war, but never at peace. And worse, the more you ignore these subtler emotions, the more they accumulate. They fester, and then you become extremely reactive. Any harsh word becomes an attack, any silence becomes an offense, any carelessness becomes proof that you are not loved. And when you live in this state of emotional readiness, everything becomes a threat. And nobody can love someone who lives in a state of war. This is where the power of vulnerability comes in. And no, I'm not talking about that corny version, where the man cries all the time and turns any dialogue into a therapy session. I'm talking about strategic vulnerability. The kind that knows what it feels, knows how to name it, knows how to communicate clearly. The man who can say, "That hurt me," instead of shouting, "You're selfish," possesses superior emotional control. He doesn't let himself be hijacked by the primary reaction. He chooses the most effective expression. And that, my dear, is seduction in its purest form. Because few things are more magnetizing than a man who knows how to say what he feels without losing his presence, without drama, without victimhood, just truth. But there's an even deeper point here. When you hide the original emotion under anger, you don't just ruin your relationships, you destroy yourself. Because constant anger reprograms your nervous system. It reduces your capacity for empathy, undermines your clarity, and makes your body sick. Research shows that men who live in a state of chronic irritation are more likely to develop heart disease, sleep disorders, and sexual dysfunction. In other words, the emotion you use to appear stronger is actually the one that weakens you the most. And if you stop to observe the most magnetic men in history, from James Bond to Marcus Aurelius, you'll notice a pattern. They all operate from an imperturbable presence. And not because they feel nothing, but because they feel with precision. Because they know how to identify the origin. Because they don't get confused by the smoke of anger. They seek the real fire. And when you master this ability to translate emotions, you enter another level of interaction with women. Because you begin to see beyond the superficial game. You see the theater of emotions. You understand that what she calls nothing much might be insecurity. That irony might be fear of exposing herself. That silence might be shame. And instead of reacting like a boy who takes everything personally, you respond like a master who sees the truth beyond appearances. That is true power. It's not reacting with anger. It's responding with precision. It's not dominating the other through fear. It's impacting the other through clarity. And this clarity only arises when you accept that anger, however intense it may seem, is just a bridge, an emotional transition. And that crossing it requires courage, not brute force. The courage to feel what lies beneath. The courage to name what is real. The courage to stop using anger as armor and start using it as a compass. And perhaps the most important point of all, this transformation is not just about you. It changes everything around you. Because a man who knows how to translate his anger into vulnerability heals the environment in which he lives. He teaches his children to deal with emotions. He inspires silent respect. He elevates the quality of relationships. He becomes a reference point, not because he imposes, but because he reveals. Because he shows that true power lies not in being feared. It lies in being whole. So the next time anger arises, stop. Breathe. Observe and ask, what am I trying to hide? It may be that you are simply afraid of being forgotten. It may be that you are feeling inadequate. It may be that you just want to be recognized. And all of this is human, profoundly human. But it only transforms when it is named. As long as it remains camouflaged, it will continue to control you. There's a stark difference between reacting and responding. A difference so subtle that few men perceive it, yet so powerful that it defines who controls your life, you or your impulses. Reaction is automatic. It's that visceral response that arises even before you understand what you're feeling. Response, on the other hand, is conscious. It arises in the interval between the trigger and the action, and it is precisely in this invisible space that your freedom resides. What you do in that interval defines whether you will be dominated by your emotions or whether you will dominate the game. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps, said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response, and in that response lies our growth and our freedom." This quote is not armchair philosophy, it's pure emotional survival. Frankl witnessed and experienced the worst of humanity. And even there, amidst torture and humiliation, he discovered that there is always a second, an internal microspace where you can decide who you will be. Now apply this to the universe of seduction, relationships, and social life. Imagine she challenges you with a provocation. You're so cold sometimes. It seems like you don't feel anything. Trigger activated. The immediate impulse would be to retort with sarcasm or withdraw into aggressive silence. But the strategist, the emotional operator within you, knows that's where the game begins. Because your response doesn't need to be governed by impulse. It can be chosen, it can be surgical, it can be transformative. This space between the trigger and the reaction is like a psychological dojo, a training ground where you learn to operate consciously, not reflexively. Most men ignore this space. They live like emotional machines. Something happens, they explode. Something hurts, they attack. Something threatens, they scream. But that's not masculinity. That's conditioning. That's the programming of a frightened boy in the body of an adult man. True power begins when you discover that you don't need to obey your impulse. You can observe, you can breathe, you can choose. And here comes the point most neglected by emotionally reactive men. You are not what you feel. You are what you choose to do with what you feel. Feeling anger, fear, frustration, all of that is human. But acting without awareness, that is immaturity. When you begin to activate this inner space, you stop living like a pinball being launched by emotions and begin to operate like the player. You are the one controlling the stick. You are the one who sets the pace. You are the one who chooses when to move and when to stop. But how do you develop this space? How do you transform reactivity into strategic operation? The answer is simple, but it requires practice. Presence. The ability to perceive, at the exact moment an emotion begins to emerge, that you are being provoked. This requires mindfulness. It requires training. It requires what we call activating the observer. The observer is that part of you that watches without getting involved, that feels the emotion arising but doesn't get confused by it, that perceives the anger but doesn't become anger. Someone who recognizes the pain but doesn't act on the pain. Now imagine you're at home. Your phone vibrates. A message from her. Something passive-aggressive, ambiguous, with a hint of irony. You feel the heat rising, your pulse quickening. But this time, you pause, and, in that second of presence you ask yourself, which response would I be proud of tomorrow? This question is magical. It shifts you from impulse to strategy. It positions you in the future, where the consequences reside. And that pause alone changes everything. Because you start choosing your response, not vomiting out your reaction. And here comes an uncomfortable truth. Most of the emotional problems you face aren't caused by the emotions themselves, but by your haste to react, by your inability to pause, by your illusion that you need to respond to everything immediately. That's ego. It's an addiction to control. It's the mistaken belief that presence is imposed with quick words, with sharp responses, with explosions at the right time. No, presence is imposed with silence when necessary, with pause when required, with inner mastery when external chaos tries to kidnap you. And make no mistake, the world will test your stability all the time. Especially women. Not out of malice, but by nature. They test because unconsciously they seek consistency. Because they want to know if you're a boy with high testosterone or a man with real presence. And they will provoke. They will oscillate. They will challenge your emotional coherence. And that's where you need to remember. The space between the trigger and the explosion is yours. Only yours. And if you surrender that space, you surrender your power. Emotionally mature men don't avoid conflict. They choose their battles. They know that not every provocation requires a response. Not every insinuation requires a defense. Not every criticism requires a counterattack. They respond when necessary. And more importantly, they respond with precision. Because they have learned to inhabit the space, to master the silence, to wait for the exact moment when their response will not be a reaction, but a direction. This emotional mastery doesn't distance you from authenticity. On the contrary, it brings you closer to your most complete version. Because you stop acting impulsively and start acting intentionally. You replace reactive behavior with proactive behavior. And the side effect of that? Respect, admiration, real presence. Because a man who doesn't rush to react transmits something rare, inner security. And that's magnetic. It doesn't matter if you're handsome, rich, or successful. If you're a man who masters the space between the trigger and the response, you're already on another level. But this mastery requires practice, and it starts small. It starts with wait before sending that rude text. It starts with I'll take a breath before responding to this provocation. It starts with I won't decide anything while I'm consumed by anger. These small exercises in presence accumulate, and suddenly you realize that the woman who used to destabilize you no longer has that power, because it wasn't her who changed. It was you who repositioned the button. And that's what few understand. Power isn't about becoming unshakable on the outside. It's about reorganizing on the inside, expanding that micro space until it becomes a command center, a decision-making center, a place where you are no longer a hostage to your emotions, but their operator. And the more you operate, the freer you become. Now that you know how to master your emotions, you need to learn how to use that to your advantage. How to transform internal control into external magnetism. How to convert emotional presence into real, immediate, and visceral desire. And that's where the forbidden manual, How to Trigger Desire in 60 Seconds, comes in. This is not just another audiobook. It's an arsenal. A forbidden manual that reveals how to awaken deep triggers of desire and connection, using codes that women can't resist, even when they try. Based on the psychology of instinct, the neuroscience of attraction, and advanced seduction techniques, this content was made for men who want to operate at a higher level. So, if you've already learned not to react like everyone else, now learn to seduce like few others. Click the button. Start now. The man who masters his emotions is already dangerous. The one who masters desire is unstoppable.